Let's talk briefly about some of the abbreviations in anthropology, the ones we use, the ones we don't use, and some of the other references to time. So, for example, we have BC and AD, BCE, CE, MYA, and YBP. The first two we don't use. Why? I want you to think of what it means. I'll give you a second. If you were thinking it meant before Christ, you're absolutely correct. And we don't like to use that terminology. AD, any ideas what it means? A lot of people think it means after death. It does not mean after death. It means Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. This is why anthropology doesn't like to use BC. So we're going to say we don't use that, and we don't use AD. And this isn't because anthropologists aren't religious. It's because anthropologists respect cultural differences. And, you know, I don't want anybody to answer this. Don't send me an email and tell me what your religion is. I want you to say out loud what your religion is. And some of you, if you're there in private, by all means do so. If not, say it in your head. Some people will say Christian. Some people will not. Some people will say Hindu. Some people will say Muslim. Some people will say Judaic, and on and on and on. Now, the problem with the terminology that refers to our Lord, not all people see Jesus of Nazareth as their Lord. So this type of time, it's a biased perspective, and we want to avoid using that biased perspective. Instead of using this type of biased perspective that's religiously biased towards Christianity, we can use BCE or CE. I use both of those in the textbook. This means before the Common Era. We're currently in the Common Era, and that's what CE means. So currently we are 2020 CE. If we looked back at, for example, when the Egyptian pyramids were made, they were made 2400 BC. Oh, BCE. There we go. Erase that just so you don't think it's a B. There, BCE. In paleoanthropology, when we're dealing with really large periods of time and also an area of archaeology that's going to go back into the millions of years, MYA is one of the abbreviations, and this means millions of years ago. And we convert all time into that. In other words, if we're saying that the Earth, and we know that the Earth was created 4.5 billion years ago, if we did have to reference that, usually, obviously we're not going that far back in paleoanthropology, but we'd say 4,500 million years, or MYA would be our abbreviation. YBP, well, because usually that gets some laughs in class as well. YBP means years before the present. And this is oftentimes associated with carbon-14 dating, for example, which gives us a calibrated date. Telling us that, for example, we're looking at a bone that's calibrated to, say, 500 years before the present. Okay, and what we would do is we'd say, okay, 500 years before the present, so simple math, and we'd take 2020 minus 500, and we'd get our time frame. Let's move on to a couple of other concepts. We also have a couple of other references to time. For example, the prehistorical period and the historical period. Prehistorical period, this refers to everything before writing. And that's going to take us back approximately to 4,500 MYA. The historical period, it begins with the invention of writing. So we're currently in the historical period, and this takes us back, and here, depending upon the society that we're looking at and when they invented writing, it's going to change. So we're going to say approximately 6,000 YBP, in around there. So those are two terms that we have. I also want to make reference to the Paleolithic. The Paleolithic begins with the invention of tools. And that takes place approximately 2.5 million years ago. And then we have a number of other lithics. For example, we have the Mesolithic. Lithic means stone. And this is approximately, we're going to say, around 20,000 years before the present to, around 12,000 YBP, in and abouts there. And then we get the Neolithic, and that begins with the invention of farming. Okay, so that's pretty much some of those time frame references that we have, and I'm going to briefly discuss some of the eras that anthropologists are interested in on the next slide. So let's move along here. So if we're engaged in something called paleoanthropology, this involves the study of human evolution. And these folks, they go back pretty far in time. So humans, when did we evolve? Well, we're going back to a period, our oldest ancestors are found in a geological epoch. That's one of the ways that we define things. The Miocene, which is approximately 20 MYA to 5 MYA, 5 million years ago. This is not the Paleolithic as yet, but this is where we're seeing the emergence of our ancestors. Following the Miocene, we get an epoch called the Pliocene, and this is approximately 5 MYA to 2.5 MYA. This is another area that paleoanthropologists are interested in, the fossilized remains of our ancestors that fit into the Pliocene, and when tools were invented 2.5 million years ago. And then we get the Pleistocene. The Pleistocene is approximately 2.5 MYA to 0.02 MYA, or about 20,000 years ago. Okay, now paleoanthropology, often it's going to stop in the Pleistocene because they start to trample on archaeological research. So roughly speaking, we can say that paleoanthropology, the study of old humans, it ends roughly, let's say approximately, for argument's sake, it's arguable though, say 100,000 years before the present. In contrast to paleoanthropology, and I'll remind you, paleoanthropology fits into physical or biological anthropology, we get archaeology. And archaeology does not go as far back as paleoanthropology. Archaeological research, it begins in the Pliocene, but only at 2.5 million years ago. And the thing that archaeologists are interested in, as pointed out up top, we have paleoanthropology interested in human evolution and fossils, those fossilized remains. Archaeology in the Pliocene, they're interested in when we start to see material culture, when we start to see tools. And archaeology will go through the Pleistocene, and it will go into the, let's write Pleistocene here as well. So they're interested in that research in the Pleistocene. They're also interested in research in the next geological epoch that we refer to as the Holocene. And the Holocene is 0.02 MYA to roughly about the 1800s. And that's when the impact that we have on our environment changes drastically. As for archaeological interest, anything that doesn't fit into a statute of limitations, for example, if you're excavating remains that are related to an individual who has they're a victim of homicide, that's forensic anthropology. So looking at the battle or the War of 1812, excavating those remains and those artifacts, that would be archaeology. Let's move along to the next slide, and I'll just briefly say something about cultural anthropology as well. So if you're asking, where does cultural anthropology fit in? Because you remember all of our fields and you're interested in completing the story, where does cultural anthropology fit in? Well, cultural anthropologists engage in ethnography. So they can only, in that ethnographic research, or we're documenting or we're graphing a society, right? We can only do it with living individuals, right? So they're working in the present. If we look at another area of cultural anthropology, ethnology, which is the comparison, right? The comparison of a variety of cultures, comparison of cultures. Well, we can only go back as far in time as recorded cultures, as far as cultures have been recorded. So it only go back, like I said, goes back to first records. So it goes back to the first recorded ethnographies. I might as well finish this off. Linguistic anthropology, it's going back as far as paleo. Right, it's going back as far as paleoanthropology. It's interested in the origins of language, and also language change. So interested in the present as well. Okay, so there you have a brief overview of time, some of the abbreviations, and some of the areas that anthropologists are interested in with respect to those specific subfields. Sorry if this looks like chicken scratch to you. I just wanted to mix it up a little bit rather than doing PowerPoint bullet after bullet. We'll leave it here. I'll see you in the next segment. Take care.